Our next speaker, Bob, is going to be talking about the Dexcom and new technologies in diabetes. His name is Tim Street. Tim has lived with type 1 diabetes for over 30 years. In that time, he has not let diabetes get in the way of him enjoying life and doing what he wants to do. More recently, he has involved himself in the community called We Are Not Waiting. Tim is a huge advocate for diabetes technology and especially the do-it-yourself looping system. And he's going to explain what looping is. He writes for Diabetech, TECH.com blog, and I'll have that on our website, where he extols the virtues of closed looping and tries to take an objective look at the world of diabetes technology from an expert user perspective, attempting to make it easier to understand some of more complex issues relating to medical technologies and accessing them. So here's Tim Street.
Thanks very much. Let me just pull up the slideshow. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about automated insulin delivery, more than just Medtronic. But let me first introduce myself. So I'm Tim Street. I'm a person who's had type 1 diabetes for some 30 odd years. I was diagnosed in 1988 at the age of 13, so I've lived with it for my entire adult life. As Brian mentioned, I'm an advocate for and user of user-led innovation in diabetes technology and write the Diabetech.com website. Of course, I do many other things as well. My outlook on diabetes is something that comes with me rather than something that is in control of me. And I think that's an important way of living with diabetes. That's a brief view of some of my disclosures before we continue. So, diabetes technology, we've been discussing it bit by bit throughout this and to some level, and it's come a very long way. If you go back to the early years of Banting and Best, there were, well, technology was not particularly sophisticated. Ultimately, that was your technology. You had insulin syringes, you had insulin in a vial, and you injected it. It was usually pig or insulin or bovine insulin, and it lasted for a number of hours. You had to eat to your insulin and you hoped that you'd survive. There wasn't even really any kind of glucose testing. And throughout the years since then, we've developed glucose testing kits, first of all by testing urine and then latterly by testing the blood. We've moved from having insulin syringes to insulin pens. During the 80s, the first pumps appeared, and then as was just mentioned, CGMs started to appear in the noughties, and at the same time, new formulations of insulin have come along, until we find ourselves where we are now with pumps and CGMs, and these are a few of the things that are available right now, whether that goes from something like the Omnipod or the Medtronic range of pumps, or even the Tandem T Slim. We've also got on there the Ipso pump, which is a Swiss company that also makes an interesting small pump that has Bluetooth capabilities. And of course, on the CGM side, you have the Dexcom G6, which has just been mentioned. You have things like the Guardian Connect from Medtronic. And you also have Abbott's range of Libre solutions. The one that's highlighted on here is the Libre 3, which is an upcoming CGM based on Libre that is likely to be available in Germany late in December, we believe, but we're waiting to see that become fully available, even though it's been announced. But the thing that's constant throughout all of this is that the whole of the technology has historically been running in a way that requires human intervention. The algorithm that controls it, if you like, is the human brain, and the human brain suffers with all sorts of problems in relation to running an algorithm, in that, namely, it gets distracted and does other things. It has to sleep. It has a whole load of other things going on. So what we've been waiting for in terms of technology is automated insulin delivery and closing the loop. And what is automated insulin delivery, or the artificial pancreas? Well, it's a few things. The important thing to remember is that I hope you can see my laser pointer. It's made up of all of the pieces we've just talked about. The CGM sensor, and we've got it here as a receiver, but that could be on the same device as the algorithm. It's an insulin pump delivering insulin. But then there's an additional piece, this important control algorithm. And this control algorithm can sit on a phone alongside the CGM receiver. It could sit on the pump alongside both the CGM receiver and the insulin delivery mechanism. But the key thing here is that this control algorithm is making the decisions as to what it's going to deliver in terms of insulin every minute of every day, according to the CGM data, the continuous glucose monitoring data that it receives. And the reason that that's important is that it can do that regardless of what you're doing. You can ignore what you're doing. It will adjust insulin levels accordingly. Now, we typically call these hybrid closed loop systems because, as it stands at the moment, the user has to input meals and has to bolus for meals. But where we hopefully will end up getting to is a fully closed loop where whenever a user eats, the system will observe glucose changes, deliver insulin, and result in them remaining within range. The range we talk about is actually similar to the one that was just mentioned. So, as Bob said, he is required to remain in 80 to 180. Typically, when we measure time in range, we measure 70 to 180 as the range that we want to be within. What we're seeing with some of the new insulins come out is that maybe this is a possibility that we can have a much greater time in range without having to enter anything. Now, that's all very well, but how do you get hold of a closed loop? What is automated insulin delivery in terms of something that can get into your hands? Well, there are commercial closed loop systems available. Tandem's Control IQ and Medtronic's 670G are both regulatory approved worldwide. Medtronic's 780G has European approval. I'm not sure if it's got a US approval yet, and that's their upgraded version. Then in Europe, we have two more automated insulin delivery systems that are currently approved. We have CAM-APS that's been developed by Cambridge University, and we have Diabetech, which comes out of Grenoble in France. All of these provide you with the ability to get on with your life and have them observe your glucose levels and run alongside you, making sure that everything works properly. But they're not the only thing. They're commercial. Both Tandems and Medtronics run on the pump. CAM-APS runs on your Android smartphone, and Diabetech runs on a separate handset. But what if you can't get access to any of these things? What if you're in a place where you have a pump already and it's not up for renewal? Well, there are also open source closed loop solutions. These are OpenAPS, Loop, and Android APS. And I'm going to take you through those shortly to explain what they are and how they've come about. But before we go there, why do people want to use automated insulin delivery systems? Well, as we've mentioned, an improved time in range is really helpful. It helps to reduce hypoglycemia, but an improved time in range is also directly correlated with your HbA1c value. And the higher the time in range, the lower that HbA1c. I use an automated insulin delivery system. It happens to be one of the open source ones. My time in range is typically about 85 to 90%. And my HbA1c accordingly is around about 5.5%. So that's within a normal HbA1c range. And that's the key clinical reason for using an AID system. Having your time in range much greater, your HbA1c lower, is directly linked to a reduction in long-term complications of type 1 diabetes and any diabetes. But there are other benefits as well that are non-clinical. It doesn't get stressed, tired, or have to look after kids. It also responds more precisely than most humans do to delivering insulin. It doesn't sleep, so you can. And all of these things together mean that it's running in the background, looking after what your glucose levels are doing, giving you the time to do other things and not having to think about it. Open source AID solutions have been around since 2015. That's approximately 3 years before the commercial systems came into play. And it's widely understood that because of the open source solutions, Medtronic's 670G was allowed to go through the FDA approval process much more quickly. In the first case, there was OpenAPS, which was built by Dana Lewis, Scott Librand, and Ben West, which runs on a small Linux computer, such as a Pi Zero or an Edison, an Explorer board. And it originated because Dana and Scott were trying to work out how to improve Dana's CGM alerting, because the CGM system they were using at the time, the Dexcom G4, simply wasn't loud enough. As a result of that, they were able to develop an algorithm that would predict glucose levels out into the future. And when they discussed it on Twitter, Ben West popped up and suggested that he had been spending some time working on decoding the communications with a pump, and working closely with them, they were able to create OpenAPS, which looked at glucose levels, adjusted glucose levels, and delivered effectively an artificial pancreas system a long way ahead of anything that was delivered by commercial systems. In 2016, that was followed by EOS Loop. Now, Loop was developed by Nate Ratcliffe and Pete Schwamm, and it runs on an iPhone. It uses a completely different algorithm from OpenAPS, and it talks to a Minimed pump or an Omnipod pump via Riley Link device, which is a small radio communications translator, I suppose is the right term, named after Pete's daughter. The Loop system, as all three of these systems can work with multiple different CGM devices. Then in 2017, Miloš Kozak from Poland developed Android APS. Android APS uses the OpenAPS algorithm, but deploys it onto an Android phone. It's a modular system that can use multiple different CGMs and has access to multiple pumps. At the moment, that includes various pumps from Roche, it includes a Suil Dana RS, it includes the Omnipod, again via Riley Link, and also the same Minimed pumps that the other two systems use. This means there are multiple open source systems available, and that they can operate with existing technology that is already in place. And that's quite important, because many people are in a position where they can't upgrade to one of the commercial systems, and it gives them access to automated insulin delivery without having to spend any more money other than for a developer license here or a bit of hardware there. We're calling it maybe maximum $250 to start using something that can be life-changing. But how about comparing open source and commercial systems? Well, we've mentioned Tandem's Control-IQ and the Medtronic 670G. All of the commercial systems are out of the box. When you purchase them, you get a device or a piece of software. In many cases, they come as an all-in-one solution with the CGM receiver, the algorithm integrated on the pump, and they often are tied to a specific CGM. So you can't use a Medtronic system with a Dexcom device, for example. You can't use the other three systems that I mentioned with anything currently other than Dexcom's G6. Some of the forthcoming solutions from the likes of Beta Bionics and Bigfoot potentially will use more than one CGM source, but they're not currently FDA approved or EMA approved, so aren't available for use at the moment. And I'm talking specifically about available solutions. However, they have limited flexibility in their target ranges, with the exception of the two European offerings, because in order to get through the FDA approval process, you have to prove that variability in targets is safe. And that is quite a substantial increase in the amount of work required in the trials. They don't have remote monitoring, although I've tagged that because the We Are Not Waiting community has developed mechanisms to allow the 670G to be remotely monitored. And apparently the new 730, 770 and 780s will have the ability to do that with a phone app. A key point is they require limited maintenance. This means that the the user themselves doesn't have to really do very much. If there's anything required, you can speak to the company providing it. In the case where it's an app, updates can be downloaded, and they have regulatory approval. Open source solutions are slightly different. They require you to build it yourself. So you download the source code, you then build it in a tool such as Android Studio or Xcode, but you're not required to do it alone. There are a lot of people out there in a peer support community who will help you. The solutions are more modular than most of the commercial systems, so you can use different CGMs, the one that suits you best, or a different pump. Therefore, they're more CGM agnostic. They have a higher level of flexibility because you can adjust the target that you want to use much more ably than you can if you are if you're using either the Medtronic or the Tandem solutions. And they have this ability to have remote monitoring and control. They will upload the data to a system called Night Scout, which is another We Are Not Waiting solution developed by Diabetes Dads in 2014 that allows sharing of glucose and AID system data. And in some cases, you can also control the system remotely. For example, on Android APS, it's possible to instruct the system to deliver a bolus via a text message. But as I mentioned, you're responsible for these systems. It relies wholly on you. So you have to undertake maintenance. So if there are updates to the system, you have to download them and rebuild the solution and get it into operation for yourself. They don't have regulatory approval because all they are distributed as is a source code, not as a medical device. And they potentially have a lower cost because you're not having to buy a system, you're simply getting free software, and it's the bits associated with that you may have to pay a small amount for. In terms of discussion about regulation in these systems, commercial AID systems go through a very, very thorough approval process for distribution as medical devices, as do all medical devices. Open source AID solutions are distributed as source code and therefore not subject to the same regulations. However, the open source solutions use approved components for insulin delivery and glucose monitoring. So the pumps and the CGM systems that are in use are all fully FDA approved. And regulators on a global basis have taken very different views of open source solutions, but it's worth going back to the first point. Regulatory approval for distribution as a medical device doesn't guarantee that it's safe. The single device with the highest number of deaths reported for a medical device is Medtronic pumps. And those are fully regulatory approved. So whether regulatory approval demonstrates safety or not is a different matter. As I mentioned, regulators on a global basis take very different views because some of them are in dialogue with the people who build these systems. In fact, the FDA has had dialogue with Scott and Dana in relation to the Open APS algorithm. But at the same time, the FDA is also, people who use these systems are aware that the FDA has issued guidance that they don't recommend these systems. That's not really a surprise. And on the other hand, in France, the regulator there has decided that they are going to be very harsh on people who provide input into the development of these systems and has come down very hard with a view that you shouldn't be doing that. So regulation does come into play, but as I mentioned, what about safety? Are open source solutions safe? Well, a study that was undertaken by Jennifer Zabinski and Dana Lewis and a number of others earlier this year, which looked at the comparison of the DIY solutions, the open source solutions with sensor augmented pumps, looking at data that had been uploaded by sensor augmented pump users and that had been uploaded by the open source AID users, determined that if you looked at the amount of time spent in hypoglycemia, actually the open source AID users was lower, that the target range that they spent time in was generally much better, obviously, because a sensor augmented pump is never going to stop hypoglycemia in the same way. But that also the number of hypoglycemic events per month was much lower, was lower, that the mean sensor glucose was quite significantly lower, and that more importantly, there were no more, in fact, there were less, there was less hypoglycemia compared to the traditional sensor augmented pump therapy. That was important because there hadn't been any kind of study as to whether or not these things were safe. And what this demonstrates is that you are unlikely, to suffer an increased rate of hypoglycemia as a result of using an open source solution. So that's a key point to take away from this, is that whilst there are a lot of people using them worldwide, and we reckon it's between 5,000 and 10,000 people, there's not as many as using the commercial systems. On the other hand, they're cheaper, they're more flexible, and they give people the opportunity to adjust more things within them to help them get on and use them. And all of this type of technology is really beneficial to the user, and that's the key point to it. Whether you want to spend the time doing the work to build it yourself, or whether you're happy to take something off the shelf, either of those types of solution will give you better outcomes than the more traditional types of therapy. And that's the key thing to take away. If you want to use technologies, look at the automated insulin delivery solutions. If what's coming off the shelf isn't good enough for you, you might want to look at the open source solutions. All of this is available, and all of this will help you to improve your outcomes. If you want to view links, these are some of the links that I like to put up and make available. Screenshots are always allowed, so feel free to take one. I'll just leave it up there for a couple of seconds. But thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak. Brian.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, so much. We're really grateful. I can't imagine myself without a CGM and pump today compared to when I was 15 years old. So you'd be taken out of my cold dead hand trying to get my pump away from me. So thank you, Tim. I'm going to have Tim's website. Linked on the speakers part of lionsdiabetes.org.